Kirk Douglas, the gladiator, the outlaw, the man who gave Spartacus his immortal cry of freedom. To the public, he was strength wrapped in charisma, the immigrant son who clawed his way to the pinnacle of American myth-making. But history is rarely written in pure gold. Behind the polished magazine covers and the heroic speeches lay shadows long ignored. Douglas's career was not just about triumph. It was about secrets buried in smoke-filled rooms, whispers exchanged between trembling actresses, and rumors the press dared not print. The same Hollywood that crowned him also hid behind him, using his fame as a shining mask to protect a darker truth. The paradox still chills. While Kirk Douglas portrayed heroes fighting tyranny on screen, he was also the man who named names, pointing fingers at peers he branded as evil during an era of fear and scandal. Yet the cruelest twist? Some said he belonged on that very list. For every accusation he cast, others circled back at him. He was both judge and suspect, a man dancing on the knife's edge between righteousness and ruin. This was Hollywood's golden age, a kingdom built on beauty, power, and silence. Stars were gods, and studios their temples. But gods fall hardest when their secrets slip through the cracks. And Kirk Douglas, for all his glory, walked that perilous line where applause turned into suspicion and the hero's mask threatened to shatter. What if the man celebrated for defeating oppressors was hiding his own cruelties? What if the gladiator of justice was also complicit in Hollywood's darkest games? In this video, we'll peel back the shimmering curtain, uncovering the scandals, betrayals, and haunting questions surrounding Kirk Douglas and the so-called most evil actors of Hollywood's golden age. He was born Isur Danielovich in 1916, the son of impoverished Jewish immigrants in Amsterdam, New York. His father worked ragged jobs, scraping by as a ragman, collecting scraps of metal and cloth that no one else wanted. The family lived on the margins. Their poverty was so severe that hunger was a constant visitor in the household. For young Isur, life was a battle before he ever stepped onto a movie set. This crucible of hardship forged in him an unshakable hunger for recognition. He would later say he had to fight for every crumb of dignity he ever got. School plays became his escape, the stage his battlefield where poverty could not follow him. He dreamed not just of survival but of transformation. To shed the name Isur Danielovich, which carried the weight of foreignness and hardship, and emerge as someone new, someone America could not ignore. By the time he reached Hollywood, the metamorphosis was complete. Isur was gone, replaced by Kirk Douglas, a name sharp and simple, perfect for marquee lights. The studios pounced on him like miners spotting gold. His looks were rugged, his voice brash, his presence volcanic. He was packaged as the all-American man, strong, principled, and untouchable. But the mask was carefully manufactured. Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s thrived on illusions. Every actor was a product, every detail controlled. Publicists painted Douglas as the hard-fighting underdog who had risen through grit, a working-class hero made good. Magazines ran stories of his charm and generosity, his devotion to family, his patriotism. He was a poster boy of a masculine integrity. What they didn't print was the volatility beneath. Friends described him as ambitious to the point of ruthlessness, a man who never forgot a slight. His timber could cut through a room. His need to dominate put a strength and a danger. Yet the studios leaned into it. That ad made his screen heroes more convincing. So the mask hardened. Kirk Douglas, the noble warrior of American cinema, the immigrant son turned gladiator, the self-made hero whose smile could sell tickets and whose charisma could silence doubt. It was a mask millions adored. But behind it,
darker impulses stirred, and the very hunger that propelled him to the top will lead him towards the shadows he would one day expose in others. The boy who had once picked through trash to survive was now storm wrapped in studio published. But the truth was already splintering beneath the surface, and soon cracks would appear in the mask. The leap from obscurity to stardom came with one punch. Not enough back alley brawl, but on screen. In 1949's champion, Douglas embodied Mitch Kelly, a boxer whose ferocity was matched only by his moral corruption. It was a role that electrified audiences and critics alike. Suddenly, the scrappy immigrant son was not just another face in the Hollywood machine. He was a contender. An Oscar nomination followed, and with it, the irresistible sense of destiny. Hollywood loves nothing more than a myth, and Kirk Douglas became one of its finest. His career blazed through the 1950s. Young Man with the Horn, Ace in the Hole, The Bad and the Beautiful. Each performance chipped deeper into the American psyche, giving audiences not only the rugged hero, but also the flawed anti-hero. Magnus' carnal charm concealed darker impulses. The irony was cruel. On screen, he was lauded for portraying characters who blurred the line between virtue and vice, while in private, those same shadows gathered around him. By the time Douglas strapped on a sword and sandals for Stanley Kubrick's epic private guest, he had entered into the realm of cinematic gods. He wasn't merely acting, he was embodying freedom, rebellion, justice. The film's climactic cry, "I am Spartacus," reverberated far beyond the theater. Douglas was held as a symbol of courage, not just for his role, but for his defiance of Hollywood's blacklist, insisting that screenwriter Dawson Trimbo be credited. To the public, this wasn't just a performance, it was heroism itself. Magazines crowned him the paragon of masculinity. His photographs stared out from life and time, each image another stroke in the painting of a man who could do no wrong. He had everything, power, fame, wealth, and the illusion of righteousness. But beneath that applause, a different story lingered in whispers. His rise without interviews. Directors called him difficult. Co-stars found him numbing, and studio executives muttered about his temper. Even those closest to him described an insatiable drive. A man who craved not just success, but control. Still, the illusion held strong. The 1950s and early 60s belonged to Kirk Douglas. He was the gladiator of the silver screen, the man who seemed larger than life, indestructible in his triumphs. Hollywood had built him up as its eternal hero. But as history proves, no spotlight burns forever. For every pedestal, there was a shadow waiting beneath it. And for Douglas, that shadow was about to grow longer, darker, and more dangerous than his audience could ever imagine.
Hollywood's golden age sparkled on the surface like a diamond, but diamonds are forged under crushing pressure and often hide cracks deep within. Kirk Douglas was no exception. By the late 1950s, as his face was plastered on magazine covers and his films filled theaters worldwide, the whispers began to slither beneath the glamour. Journalists in smoky bars spoke of his temper, of late-night encounters where charm turned to menace. Studio assistants, too frightened to put their names in print, murmured about his volatility, the way he would erupt when challenged, the piercing stare that could silence a room. To the public, he was Spartacus, the liberator. To insiders, he was a man you did not want to cross. There were also darker murmurs, stories that hovered between rumor and accusation. Tales of women precious into silence, of incidents swept away by the iron broom of studio power. Hollywood in that era had perfected the art of erasure. A quick payoff here, a threatening phone call there, and the morning papers carried it nothing but glowing reviews. The official record read hero, while the unofficial one told a different story.
Even Douglas's colleagues hinted at contradictions. Director Billy Wilder once quipped that Douglas had the smile of a saint in the eyes of a killer. Co-stars alternated between praising his intensity and quietly admitting he could be frightening. Behind closed doors, the gladiator mask slipped, revealing not freedom, but control, not justice, but dominance. And yet, the system thrived on these contradictions. A man could be celebrated for portraying flawed, dangerous characters precisely because he carried a touch of that danger within himself. The public adored his intensity without ever questioning its origin. His darkness fed the myth. But the whispers never stopped. Rumors grew that Douglas knew too much about the secret vices of Hollywood's power players, the parties behind locked doors, the stars whose charm masked cruelty, the moguls who covered sins with money and influence. Whether out of defiance or hubris, Douglas sometimes spoke of these things, naming names in private conversations that later echoed as scandalous revelations. And this is where the paradox sharpened. Was Kirk Douglas the brave truth teller exposing the monsters of Hollywood? Or was he one of them, pointing fingers to keep suspicion from turning back on himself? The curtain had to be pulled ever so slightly. Audiences still adored him, but within the industry, the tension was building. The gladiator was standing in the arena, far more treacherous than any scripted battle. One where reputations, secrets, and lives were at stake. The applause thundered on. The magazines kept printing his smile. But beneath the roar of admiration, the whispers only grew louder. The worst, however, was still to come. By the 1960s, Kirk Douglas's name had become synonymous with Hollywood power. He was not just a star, he was a producer, a man who could greenlight projects, challenge the blacklist, and shape the industry's future. But power is a double-edged sword, and in Hollywood, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Whispers that once drifting smoky bars now begin to take shape in bolder tones. Reporters who dared to scratch beneath the glamour spoke of Douglas's ruthless ambition, his volcanic temper, and were damningly accusations from women whose voices were never meant to be heard. And in industry that thrived on silence, those voices were quickly buried, but fragments leaked, enough to poison the perfect image. It was the allegation of a young actress, unnamed in official accounts, who claimed Douglas's charm turned predatory in private. Studio fixers rushed in, quashing stories with cash or threats. Hollywood had long perfected this dark choreography, victims erased, perpetrators polished. And when rumors could not be silenced, they were spun into fiction, brushed off as jealous gossip, nothing more. But Douglas was not only the subject of accusations, he was also the accuser. In certain interviews and conversations, he alluded to evil actors of his era, figures who used their fame to exploit, manipulate, and destroy. He named them in private, sometimes publicly hinting, always walking the line between revelation and protection. To some, this made him a whistleblower, a gladiator once again, fighting not for Spartacus, but for truth. Yet, the paradox grew unbearable. How could a man facing his own shadow stand as judge of others? Was he deflecting attention from his sins or genuinely unmasking predators? Biographers still argue. Some portray him as courageous for daring to expose colleagues when few dared to speak. Others insist he belonged among those very names, that his revelations were less about justice and more about survival in a world built on hypocrisy. Newspapers, ever eager for sensation, tiptoed around the issue. They reported his triumphs, his bold stands against censorship, his groundbreaking films. Absent were the whispers of actresses who complained of him, the warnings of co-stars who found him dangerous. In the official record, Kirk Douglas remained the gladiator, not the accused. But behind closed doors, the testimonies piled up, fragments of a darker truth that no headline dared to carry. The gladiator had taken center stage in a real-life trial, not of law, but of morality. And though the jury of public opinion kept applauding, a few brave voices refused to let the silence stand. For Douglas, the applause thundered on, but in the shadows, his name now sat alongside those he condemned. Hero and monster, accuser and accused, Hollywood's paradox incarnate. And yet, the industry itself would soon prove it had more power than any revelation. Because if Kirk Douglas was fire, Hollywood was the machine built to smother smoke before it could rise. And Hollywood in the mid-20th century was not just a dream factory, it was a fortress. The studios controlled everything, the image of their stars, the headlines in the press, even the rumors that dared to circulate in cocktail lounges. When scandal threatened, they moved like a military operation, swiftly, silently, and ruthlessly. Kirk Douglas was both a beneficiary and a prisoner of that fortress. As accusations began to circulate, the system that had once polished him into a symbol of masculine virtue now worked overtime to protect its investment. Publishers called editors, studio executives leaned on journalists with the weight of advertising dollars. Stories evaporated before ink could touch newsprint. Careers of would-be whistleblowers withered. The silence was not natural, it was engineered. The press played its role dutifully. Magazines that printed his dazzling smile refused to touch the shadows behind it. Headlines reclaimed his courage for defying the blacklist, his box office triumphs, his family man persona. Absent were the whispers of activists who complained of him, the warnings of co-stars who found him dangerous. In the official record, Kirk Douglas remained the gladiator, not the accused. But behind the curtain, the cover-ups were chillingly precise. If an actress threatened to speak, she found her roles drying up overnight. If a staff member talked too freely, he was transferred or dismissed. Payoffs were arranged, sometimes in envelopes, sometimes in contracts, and magically appeared after troubling encounters, and when all else failed, intimidation did the right. Douglas himself seemed to know the game. He had clawed his way from poverty into Hollywood royalty. He understood that power was not just about talent, but about silence. In interviews, he named evil actors of his era, figures who used their fame to exploit, manipulate, and destroy. He named them in private, sometimes publicly hinting, always walking the line between revelation and protection. To some, this made him a whistleblower and their acclaimed name scrappy, and to scores of colleagues and others. And so the cycle continued. Headlines gleamed, box office receipts soared, and the public never saw the blood spilled in the shadows. The gladiator was untouchable, not because he was innocent, but because Hollywood had decreed it so. But the walls and fortresses eventually crack, and when they do, the legacies of those who once seemed immortal are exposed in all their contradictions.
Time is merciless, even to legends. As the decades rolled on, Kirk Douglas aged into a statesman of Hollywood, his chin still sharp, his presence still commanding. But the whispers never quite died. They lingered like smoke after a fire, faint yet impossible to ignore. To the public, his legacy was gilded. Honors poured in, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Lifetime Achievement Awards, standing ovations at ceremonies where the industry applauded itself. He was celebrated as a survivor of Hollywood's brutal machinery, a man who had risen from rags to riches, from obscurity to immortality. His role in breaking the blacklist was enshrined in history textbooks. For millions, Douglas remained the gladiator who stood against tyranny. But history, especially Hollywood histories, never pure.
Biographers revisiting his life noted the duality: the courageous producer who defied censorship, and the volatile man accused of cruelty behind closed doors. For every magazine tribute, there were hushed recollections from colleagues and shadows of testimonies left unrecorded. Some actors praised him as a mentor, others called him ruthless, even dangerous. Actresses whispered stories that the press of his era would not print, but which circulated in biographies decades later. In the Me Too era, his name resurfaced with renewed scrutiny. Allegations that had once been buried were suddenly reevaluated, placed against the backdrop of a culture that had long protected men of power. For some, Duckers became a symbol of the hypocrisy of Hollywood's golden age, the way it built gods out of men while erasing the voices of the vulnerable. And yet, the myth endured. Television reruns of Spartacus and Paths of Glory still painted him as a hero. His autobiography portrayed a man flawed but determined, never apologizing fully, never conceding to the rumors that trailed him. When he passed away in 2020, at the staggering age of 103, obituaries hailed him as a lion of Hollywood, a titan of the silver screen. The darker shadows were acknowledged, yes, but quickly buried under the weight of accolades. That is the paradox of Kirk Douglas's legacy. To many, he will forever be Spartacus, the gladiator who defied Rome, the star who broke the blacklist. To others, he remains a man whose darker impulses were shielded by an industry more concerned with profits than people. The applause that followed him to the grave was real, but so were the silences of those whose stories were never told. His legacy, like Hollywood itself, remains a hall of mirrors, dazzling, distorted, haunted by shadows that refuse to fade. The gladiator conquered time, but the whispers endure. The curtain falls, the applause fades, the theater empties, leaving only silence and the ghostly echo of clapping hands. Kirk Douglas's story, like so many of Hollywood's golden myths, is little tale of one man and more a reflection of an industry that forged gods out of mortals and then buried their sins beneath a silver life. He was Spartacus, the rebel who defied empire. He was an immigrant son who clawed his way from poverty to immortality. He was also the man whose name appeared in whispers, whose shadow clung to the walls of Desmond, whose contradictions bled into every role he played. Hero and monster, savior and suspect, a paradox carved into the very stone of Hollywood's history. Time has not solved the riddle. His legacy remains suspended between admiration and unease. The film still shines, the myth still captivates, but beneath the polished reels, another story lingers, stubborn and unresolved. Was Kirk Douglas the man who bravely named Hollywood's price judge, or was he hiding among them all along? The tragedy is not only his, but Hollywood's itself. A kingdom that award silence, protects power, and leaves its victims in the shadows. History may honor Douglas as a titan, but the voices erased in his time still haunt the industry today. The spotlight is gone now. The gladiator rests, yet the mask he won, the heroic visage that concealed a dogged reality, remains a warning. Stardom is never pure, ledgers are never flawless, and the truth is always more complicated than the image that flickers on a silver screen. Hero or predator, Hollywood may never tell, and the next star to be exposed might be the one who admire the most.